there are traditions of dealing with the past in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, and very rarely are these consulted when we think about dealing with the past. It's all these kind of modern politics. But society has been dealing with the past since whenever. And that's something we've got to think about. We've got to take kind of this long duration and look at the indigenous sources that are in society of dealing with the past. So that's some of the topics that I'd like to deal with today. Hence, what might seem complicated, what I'd like to do here in general is to say one of the things that academics are very good at is mystification. We write big titles and they mystify. I think one of our tasks is actually demystification. We've got to kind of break up these titles and explain these are very simple notions. They might seem like complicated notions, they're very simple. Anybody can relate to them. It doesn't have to be, and I was happy to hear here that it's not just academics in this room, that it's a mix from different places. Because the debate shouldn't be an academic debate proper. And it is remarkable to be saying these things in this room, specifically with all the pictures around and the ghosts which are here, which is remarkable, which we've heard about. So the subtitle for the book is Social Forgetting and Vernacular Historiography of Rebellion in Ulster. So what are these terms? Vernacular historiography sounds like a very complicated term. But in general, what I'm trying to say is that there's vernacular, local traditions of telling history. And they deserve to be counted as a historiography like any other historiography. It's not just academics that write history that turns into historiography because it's constantly being rewritten. Communities have been doing that all the time in different forms and different media. We've got to take that into the past. Take that into account when we deal with the past, That's something we've got to deal with. Academics, it's always too easy just to read historians about history. It's just part of the picture. It's just part of the source material we should be looking at. And if we do that, and we look at traditions specifically in Northern Ireland, but in other places, we might encounter something remarkable. And that maybe is the theoretical novelty of this book. We might encounter phenomena called social forgetting. Well, it's a term that I've coined, but I'm going to explain what it means. So let me break for you this term, just so we do a bit of theory and then we'll delve into the practice. So I know that theory is supposed to be kept at Queen's, at Ulster University. We don't do this in everyday life, but it's not true. Theory can be dealt in every way. So let's look at what I mean by social forgetting. Let's just clarify the term so we'll be on equal ground here. What do I mean by social forgetting? First of all, it's important to understand I refer to intentional forgetting. What happens when you want to forget something on purpose? There's a whole field in psychology of deliberate forgetting, when you have embarrassing things that you don't want. And it's a very problematic field. I'll give some examples maybe if there's time. But it's a certain case, because it's not passive forgetting. All the time we forget things. It's not about where I put my keys. It's about saying this is something I don't want, it's embarrassing, it's unpleasant, I'm going to try and forget it if I can. That's important to remember. Now, forgetting is very important in history. Historians haven't even begun to study properly forgetting. Most of history we'd like to think was remembered and the exception was forgetting. That's not true. Most of history was forgotten. The exception is what we remember and record. In any given day, we forget almost everything that happened during that day, that we've seen during that day, and remember very little. So I'm not dealing with the things which are being forgotten completely. I'm dealing with something very specific here. And the next point I'd like to say is this is a social process as far as I'm concerned. This is not an individual process. It's about people together, a community, a society, trying to forget events. In that sense, I'm talking about social forgetting and putting it in tandem with social memory. A community can remember in different forms, or groups can remember in different forms, and they can also forget. Now, social memory is a term which is perhaps less familiar than collective memory. I don't like using the term collective memory. It's more popular to use it, it's more common, but I think it's also a misleading term. Sometimes I use it for very specific situations. Collective memory gives us the illusion that we remember as a collective, in a homogeneous way, as a group. We all have the same memory. That's very rare. It's always contested. There's always a hierarchy. There's always people who have more cultural capital, if you wish, or more invested in the memory and want to influence others. People who are being pushed out. Collective memory also has this notion of top-down. The government decides for us, or a group or an elite decides, and people just receive it. That's not how it works. And it's important to remember that. Because the correlative, if we have this notion of collective memory, then we'll expect to see collective amnesia. And I'm not talking about collective amnesia because whenever I've looked at cases, and hence my interest, by the way, in the Spanish flu, and in many other cases, for years now I've been looking at different cases around the world of cases which we think have been forgotten. What does that mean? And the important thing to remember is memory doesn't work like a light bulb. So I asked where the light switch is here. We'd like to think that we can switch off a light and switch it on. And that's how memory works. It doesn't. You don't switch on memory. And you don't just switch it off one day and it disappears. It's a process. And things stay as we go along. So not only is it not collective amnesia, that something is just kind of collectively, we decide to forget something and it just happens. And I'll explain what does happen, what I think happens as we go along. And it's also not total oblivion. It's not pressing delete and it disappears. Inevitably, whenever I've looked at cases where we think something has been forgotten in history deliberately, the picture, the more we dig into it, the more complicated it gets. And we'll look at one case together here. So the dynamic I'm looking towards is a process of disremembering. We're trying to put aside something, to disremember it. But the more I look at it, I realize that disremembering is actually a form of remembrance. It's a very strange form of remembrance, and it's actually more prevalent than we think. We do a lot of disremembering, we just don't think about it. And we haven't studied it as historians. We've got to think what that means in terms of our history. Just to use another term before we move on and put theory aside for a bit, but I think we should always think about what the wider implications. Because this is bigger than Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland also plays a big part in it. Often we'll hear the term of popular memory. Sounds great, popular memory. The problem with popular memory is, and this is where we relate to the opposite, there's also unpopular memories. And this, it might take me a strong effort to explain that in various forums. In Northern Ireland, I think I don't have a problem explaining that. What is popular for one group is unpopular for another group. There's people inside and there's people outside. So it's always contested. And so a lot of social forgetting or disremembering is trying to wipe out the narrative of the other group, or things which are not convenient for you. So you've got to think of these terms. In general, what do I mean by social forgetting? And you'll see these kind of captions which relate to the poster here, and the kind of, in a nutshell, if you wish, synopsises of various chapters in the book, which are demonstrated in great detail, but if you want to know kind of the thesis behind it, the key point is I'm saying that social forgetting, if you want a definition, a quick definition, it's a complicated term. It's what happens when a community tries to put aside discomforting events in its past, events which are no longer convenient. Now this complicates the whole field of memory studies, because for the last 30 years I've been told time and time again, I read constantly works on memory studies, and there's thousands of them. I'm always told that memory is about the present more than it is about the past. Our present needs form our memory of the past. If so, if something is inconvenient now, then it should be forgotten with no problem. But it doesn't work like that. It's much more complicated, the relationship between present and past. What I would add here is that, social forgetting actually creates a different dynamic. It's the dynamic of saying we forgot something, professing publicly we forgot about it, not talking about it in public, but talking about it behind closed doors. Speaking about it in private forums, in local forums. This is what's interesting, this kind of tension. And this happens. And we can think about different scenarios. Sometimes it happens unconsciously. The classic example of what disremembering is, the judge. We've all seen this, maybe not personally, but we've seen it at least in American dramas on TV. The judge instructs the jury, this is inadmissible, this piece of evidence. Strike it off the record, forget it. Will that evidence be forgotten during the proceedings? It won't be spoken about, because everybody's going to try very hard not to speak about it. But it's going to stay there as an elephant in the room. In a way, this is about the elephants in the room that are there, and how we deal with them, that we don't speak about them and discuss them maybe behind closed doors or in our mind. So it's this tension between public forgetting, sometimes reticence, sometimes silencing. It might be enforced that we're not allowed to talk about these topics. And between private and local remembrance. And we have a challenge as historians, and as people interested in the past. How do we get to these hidden histories? How do we find this private local remembrance? For years I was told as a student, you can't get to that. It's a great question, Guy, but you can't get to that because history is about the winners writing history, you only get the public narratives. That's not true. And it's definitely not true in Northern Ireland, where there's so much documentation, where the sources are so rich, but it's not true in practically every society. Just have to find other ways. And that's why we need a term like vernacular historiography. In the past, I used the term folk history. I specialized in folklore in order to try and access stories which were less seen by historians. I'm using the term folk history less now, only for certain circumstances, because folk history is very good with oral traditions, how we work with oral narratives that went through time. That's folklore. But it's not just folklore. Folklore likes to say we look at the oral world, not at print. But a lot of this is in print. A lot of material is in print and not looked at. Works of antiquarians, local historians, travel books, books of poetry, books of literature, they're full of history. This is all part of vernacular historiography. A lot of it relates to artifacts, material culture. The objects we find in museums and in folk museums and people's homes, which can tell us a lot about the past. Visual material. So I'm going to give you a little flavor of some of this material. But the bottom line is that when I went to look at this study and chose a case which people told me has been forgotten in Northern Ireland, not only has it been forgotten, by going through a process of social forgetting and trying to access and follow this process, I had to turn to vernacular historiography. And suddenly I found that I have thousands of sources. Not hundreds, thousands. So there's lots of sources. You just have to access them. And I'll show some of them as we go along. So, we're going to delve into the issue closer now, but I'm going back to the title of the talk. I explained the term disremembering, but I have one more comment about the term disremembering. It sounds like a very strong academic term, disremembering, kind of like postmodernism or something. We should be careful about that. Disremembering is a vernacular term. From here, if you look at works of antiquarians, you look at how speech was used in Ulster 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. Patterson, for example, famous antiquarian in Belfast in his day in the early 20th century, up until the early 20th century, in his glossary of words in use in counties Antrim and Down, disremember is used as a synonym for forgetting. Even more interesting is this glossary of Ulster speech from 1910 by Byers, because it has a few meanings. One is to forget, be unable to recall. But this is where idiom comes in. And this is where Ulster speech becomes remarkably interesting. It's also used to pretend to forget. Be unwilling or inclined not to remember. Get your head around that one. And that maybe says it all. Because the more you look at disremembering and at social forgetting, you see that it's actually an act. It's a charade. It's a masquerade. It's feigned forgetting. You say we forget something, but you remember it at the same time. And that opens a whole new path of inquiry, which is fantastic. This kind of veiled form of social remembrance. It's not the parades. It's not the things that catch the headlines. It's not the big statues. It's the stories which you tell which supposedly have been forgotten. And there are a lot of these stories around on many areas. You can take this in many different paths. So, with that in mind, let's look at 98 and the United Irish past. And this is worthwhile, I think, for a few reasons. Is exactly because what we don't have in a lot of discussions on the past is historical perspective. When we talk about the Troubles, they're close. We think that we're away from them, but they're still too close. They're still too fresh. They're next to us. Any statement we make about the Troubles is a statement about today and who we are now. We don't have perspective. We can take the decade of centenaries. That gives us 100 years perspective. Also not that much. United Irishmen is interesting because it gives us 2 centuries, more than 2 centuries, where we can follow the development of social forgetting and social remembrance, of memory and forgetting, over 2 centuries, and we can see the dynamics of how it goes up and down, and it's a complicated story. And that's what makes it interesting. So sometimes we need historical perspective. Last comment before we actually follow social forgetting is that the United Irishmen are interesting for several reasons. But one, if we return to the radical moment from which they emerged, they themselves engaged in dealing with the past. One of the famous, quoted a lot during the time of the bicentennial, one of the famous manifestos that comes out in the proceedings of one of the early meetings in Dublin in 1791 with a famous quote. They're looking at the past. We have thought little about our ancestors, much of our posterity. Are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over fields which these ancestors stained with blood? So it's exactly about dealing with the past and trying to put a difficult past away. And exactly, they're suggesting that perhaps we should choose silence, a very typical way of looking at it. We see this and are silent, but we gladly look forward to brighter prospects, to a people united in the fellowship of freedom. So to put aside difficult pasts. But by doing that, they were also creating new difficult pasts. So there's a dilemma at play here. And we need to look at the legacies of 1798 and the United Irishmen. And I say legacies in the plural because there's not one legacy. There's many legacies. To pick up on something that Peter said in my previous book, one of my previous books, I looked at a different arena years ago. I looked at 1798 in the west of Ireland. Different set of sources. Most of my sources were folklore sources in Irish. I had to learn Irish for it. I had to spend time in Mayo, Galway, Connemara, all the way through to Longford, following what happens with these traditions. But if you look at the two covers of the book, they'll show you how they're two different books, supposedly dealing with the same topic. One is more about memory in the open, which ends up with big parades after 100 years. About celebration and the story of kind of a rising nationalism coming out of it. Whereas in Ulster, it's a story which has its moments in public, but often has its moments in private. So it's a story on the one hand of folk history and social memory. When we come to Ulster, we have to look at something more complicated, of vernacular historiography, which I've explained, and social forgetting. So with that in mind, let's go back to 1798. In this room, I feel comfortable enough not to explain the rebellion. We'd need 10 minutes at least for that, at least. And I assume most people know about the rebellion. But the important thing to realize is, and I think that's also well known in this room, but at least since the work of Tony Stewart it's quite clear, this was a set of a series of rebellions. It had different character in different areas. We can argue how much they're connected or not connected. It's a political question to some level. Tony Stewart would have argued that the rebellion in Ulster was on a different planet almost. I'm not sure about that. But it was different arenas. There's an arena, the main arena of 1798 is the area of South East Leinster, Wexford, Wicklow, the areas around Dublin. At the very end of the summer, there's the French invasion, what happens in Mayo. An interesting story as well in terms of how it was remembered afterwards. But Ulster, counties Antrim and Down, and parts of Derry, Londonderry, was often dismissed as being very short. It was only a week, supposedly. There were things that went beyond the week, but it was a week, a very violent week. And if you look at the official historiography of this week, you'll find time and time again this week is dismissed in history books. Time and time again it said, yes, there was a rebellion, but it was nothing. It came and went. It's a blink. It's just a little blimp in history. It doesn't mean anything. And you can still see this in books which come out nowadays, even after the bicentennial, even after all the literature we have about it. And that's misleading, because the more you look at it, this is a map from Tony Stewart's book, across Antrim and Down, so many conflicts, so many places. It was a very, very bloody conflict. It cut very, very deep. It left a legacy which went many years afterwards. So it's much more than that. First of all, it can't be belittled. Belittling it was a political project. And there was an attempt to do this. It was a polemic. We've got to realize the politics behind belittling it. So first of all, it's a much larger scale than it seems. The other thing is, we're all aware probably in this room, is there's a different composition of forces in each of the rebellions. The backbone of the rebellion in the north are the dissenters, the Presbyterians of Ulster Scots background. There were lots of Catholics. There was a certain amount, very hard to determine, of various churches, but Church of Ireland, various Protestant churches, but specifically Church of Ireland. But specifically, the people behind the rebellion in the north were the Presbyterians of Antrim and Down. And this makes an interesting case study relating to the issues I talked about before. Why? And this might be obvious to all of us, but let's just illustrate it quickly by taking the case of Ballynahinch, just so I can show it visually. I can show it about any corner in Antrim and Down. If we look at Ballynahinch, for example. So Ballynahinch, in 1798, the famous painting by Robinson, a period painting, comes out shortly after the rebellion. This is the attempt of official history to determine what happened. It's an official representation. It was painted for the ascendancy. It even imitates an image of the period which is well known. It's built on the template of those who know Wolfe's death in Quebec, in the taking of Quebec. So he's copying Benjamin West's famous painting from North America, which is well known because it was circulating here in different cheap forms. So we see here, this is about the victors telling their story of history and the casualties that they paid. We're the rebels here. In the background, green flag in the background if we go for it. But of course there's a rebel here as well. Hugh McCulloch. A rebel who is being dragged to be hung on a windmill. A rebel, by the way, whose brother, a rebel colonel, United Irish colonel, whose brother is in the yeomanry. And that's something we see time and time again. It hasn't been properly studied, how much the rebellion was actually a civil war. And that's another point, which is more complicated. But we do see the masses that turned out in huge numbers to take part in this rebellion. But if we go back to the same area sometime later, we'll see a different picture, because something happens after the rebellion. And that's the Act of Union. Once the rebellion is suppressed, the Act of Union is passed. And there's an incentive for Presbyterians and Protestant communities in general, and this is being pushed very strongly, to change their politics. So people will move from republicanism as it was at the end of the 18th century, a bit different from republicanism today. Not totally unrelated, but a bit different. To move towards unionism, a new ideology, towards loyalism, a more established ideology, towards Orangism. So if we were to visit Ballynahinch later in the 19th century, we'd see scenes like this. Orange marches. And those marching in the parades would often be people who had formerly been United Irishmen. Or, a few years later, their children. And a few years later, their grandchildren. All the way to the present day. So we have centres of unionism and loyalism throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, which at the end of the late 18th century were actually pockets of radical republicanism. And so here we see the incentive of social forgetting. You have an event which no longer coincides or no longer matches your current politics. What do you do with it? You have an incentive to forget it, but how do you forget it? Now, I have a lot to say about this, and we'll see how far we can go from this point onwards, because I've already taken a lot of time, I've realized, much more than I thought. So we'll run through a few things, but this is how we disremember 1798. So let's just give a few examples. And I'll rush through this quickly, because this is the gist of the talk, but I wanted to give you the full background. The rest you can get from the book, more or less. But how are people keeping? Because it's quite warm in here. I mean, are you okay? Can we take... Do you have some time? Should we take... So I give 15 minutes more of... Because from now on I've got a lot to say, but I'll lead you through things as we go along. Just to show how you work with vernacular historiography to unlock social forgetting. So if you go to areas which are strongly unionist and in their politics would constantly vote for unionist candidates, and you think they'd completely forgotten the United Irish heritage, look at the material culture and you'll find scenes like this. You'll find people will keep in their house. You know, the pike and the thatch is an old Republican trope, isn't it? Appears in songs, a Fenian trope. But people actually had pikes, and still have pikes, some of them. And swords and cannonballs and bullet pieces. This family over here, George and James Gray McCartney from Six Roads Ends, keeping a whole set of dishes and cutlery which are attributed to Betsy Gray, County Down folk heroine. Did she exist? Didn't she? That's a different question. But the pieces are being kept as relics of 1798 and of the United Irishmen. A woman in Portaferry who holds this silk handkerchief, which actually goes back to the centenary, but becomes a relic through which you can tell stories of McCracken, of William Orr, of Henry Monroe. So all these kind of relics kept in houses of unionist households, which are quite remarkable. So that's one way of accessing it, through material culture, the stories told about material culture and relics. Something we've got to be aware of is the whole notion of social forgetting, as you always talk about it in a skewered way, through a glass darkly, if you wish, in a kind of, you cover it up as you talk about it. So you need to get used to euphemisms, something we're all well familiar with in Northern Ireland. It's a society loaded with euphemisms, probably more than any other society I know. But the classic case in this case would be the various names with which 98 was referred to. One of them being the turnout. Not the only, probably the most popular, but there were many other terms. It was even referred to, by the way, as the Troubles. It was the Troubles of then. So it's interesting how the term Troubles is recycled again and again in history. But the turnout is interesting. And just to show how vernacular history can tell us about the turnout. So you can find, for example, the writings of Samuel McSkimmon. Samuel McSkimmon, the historian of Antrim, is an amateur historian. He's not an official historian. He's an antiquarian. He's a shopkeeper in Carrickfergus. Even how he gets to Carrickfergus is interesting, because he comes from Ballyclare. But he was fingered as an informer, which he always thought was a grievance. He said this was wrong, but that's a different point. And he escapes to Carrickfergus. And he joins the yeomanry. And he takes part in suppressing the rebels. And that lays heavy on his conscience. It took me a long time to understand what's happening there, because it troubles him all the time. And his deathbed, he tells the story of how he still can't forgive himself for burning down the Doak Book Club. Because the Doak Book Club in County Antrim was where he learned to read and write, and it was a model library of the Enlightenment. And that was his own place. But he was sent there with a party of yeomanry and they destroyed the place. So he took part in an atrocity. He had friends on the other side. He'd write afterwards under a pseudonym or with his initials, a travel book of rambles through Antrim 10 years after the rebellion. And each place he goes to, he's haunted by memories of places where he knows people that he knew. And he was involved in killing them. His obituary is remarkable. Perhaps written by Thomas Davis, it's not clear, in The Nation, one of his obituaries when he dies, where he says, his store of traditions was great. He used to go walking about the county Antrim, gossiping with the people. The only way, in his opinion, to come at the truth from the poorer people, who were up in 98, was to make them free with drink. And in this way, he said, he laid out a good deal of money for his information. So he's playing people with drink to get from them stories of 98. And he compiles these stories. But he can't publish them because there's a public culture of silence which he's implicated in. So when he writes his history of Carrickfergus, which is a history of Antrim, each edition he slips in a little bit more. But he can't tell too much. It's all a work of social forgetting, slowly challenging his own boundaries. At first he says in Carrickfergus there was nothing. He knows that William Orr was executed in Carrickfergus. He knows the story of Carrickfergus. But he can't take it out, bit by bit. And the whole time he's writing a book about 1798, which he can't publish. It comes out posthumously. And when it does come out, his Annals of Ulster or Ireland 50 years ago, it's not even called 1798. Only later, the whole book is about 1798. And traditions which he collected always from a loyalist perspective. With a huge bias, but rich in traditions. And if you read that, you'll find a footnote where he explains. In speaking of this insurrection, which is very rarely called a rebellion, but commonly called the turnout. The call used at the time to those who appeared tardy to come forth to the ranks. Now I find this interesting on many levels, but just as a hint here. Look at the ambiguity. It's the turnout was a term used for those who were tardy to come out. They were reluctant rebels. That's a narrative which is throughout folklore and folk traditions. It's a way of dealing with an episode which you're uncomfortable with. Yes, my father rebelled, but he didn't really want to rebel. He had to. They went with great enthusiasm in 98, but afterwards when you tell the tale again, it becomes a more ambiguous story. Even then it was an ambiguous story from the beginning. So it's quite interesting in that sense. Just to show how the turnout appears in vernacular sources, let's take a less familiar case. Adam Lynn, a poet, less known poet from Cullibackie, near Ballymena, mid-Antrim. He wrote in Ulster Scots verse, and he wrote in unionist newspapers. He was a unionist. So he's not the likely topic. He's not the kind of poet. There's lots of poets who wrote about 98, like James Orr and others who are familiar to us. It's the ones who are less familiar which took a lot of effort to get to. So when you find Adam Lynn, where I did find his relevant verses, it's in his collection, Random Rhymes. He has a poem called The 12th of July. It's a poem about the 12th of July, the last place you'd expect to see something about United Irishmen. I might need some help here. Is anybody here okay with Ulster Scots dialect? Can somebody help me here? Because otherwise I'm going to savage it, which will be terrible. If somebody could do it, it would be much better for nobody's going to raise to the challenge here?
It's relevant. Anybody could make up what they need.
That's one perspective. Others wouldn't agree with that. So I'm not going to go down that minefield. But look at the verses here. I'll translate it if you wish, even though we can work it out. So, few of us men from the Scots to remember, mind. Few of us men, the turn out fecht. Now we know it's pronounced, the turn out fecht, that was fought, that took place here in 98. I would not like to be overstretched, right? I wouldn't want to deal with it too much. But ye all ken from no, again Scots. The civil side had nae the wecht for sugar men. The civil side, the people, couldn't defeat the soldiers. So there's a whole verse here about not being able to remember 98, embedded in a poem about the 12th of July. And the more you look at it, there's so many cases like that of poets writing about how you can't write about it and write about it all the same. In coded forms. And that's a lot what social forgetting is about euphemism and coded forms. That those who understand, and outsiders don't. And therefore you don't have to be afraid of censorship. Censorship is not even an issue. It's not going to bother anybody. So that's a way of remembering 98. So much more. I'm hesitant what to show, but we'll keep on going. For example, transitional justice in the immediate aftermath of 1798. There was transitional justice in the immediate aftermath of 1798. Lord Cornwallis brought in a policy of amnesty, Rebels who turned in their arms were supposed to get a pardon. If they get a pardon, everything is forgiven. And if it's forgiven, then it's forgotten. That was the policy that was brought in immediately after the rebellion, supposedly. It was undermined. It was undermined by loyalists who constantly wanted revenge, who demanded executions. And these executions undermine this policy of trying to actually bring forgetting. So social forgetting remembers cases of the execution of Henry Joy McCracken. Of course, that's a famous case. Maybe the most lenient of cases because they didn't degrade his body. He was buried without being decapitated. Others didn't. Others were decapitated and their head was left on a spike for months afterwards, and this was remembered. And all these stories of the violence of suppressing the rebellion, it was terrible violence. For years, historians thought the rebellion in Ulster was a small rebellion and no violence was applied to putting it down. In fact, number-wise, it got the lion's share of violence was actually in the north. There are more court-martials that end with corporal punishment in the north and with death sentences and very violent deaths and lashes of hundreds of lashes. It's unbelievable the cruelty in which it was put down. So stories like this, sites like this, Watty Graham's Beach in Mahira. This tree doesn't exist anymore. I think in the 1940s it was struck by thunder, by lightning, and it no longer exists. It still exists in stories, of course, people can point it out. But in a place where you couldn't put monuments to the dead, you'd have stories about how Walter Grimes, the United Irishman, was executed on this tree, lynched more or less. The soldiers decapitated him and played football with his head. And so the wall, afterwards for years, people said they could point to where the bloodstains were. His servant, a Catholic servant, had to walk the streets and say, carry the head and say, here is the head of a traitor. But the inside joke in folklore was, and this is how you undermine it, he said, here is the head, poor crater. So the poor creature. So human euphemism works in different ways. These kind of sites stayed in memory under the surface. It's a form of dealing with something and not dealing with something. And they undermine the whole notion of amnesia from the very beginning. If we want to move on, actually I'll leave these captions, I'll go quickly, but the notion of, I have these kind of summaries, but you can see that in the poster afterwards more or less. The notion that we think that policies of amnesty initiate forgetting, in many ways they're undermined by the brutality of putting down a rebellion, and therefore they actually initiate hidden forms of remembrance which persevere afterwards. Another example, and again there's hundreds of examples as we move with time, but if we look at the generation, this I have to deal with if we're in this room, the generation of Ann McCracken. What about the people who survived the rebellion? How did they preserve the memory of the rebels when they couldn't set up monuments, when they couldn't have gatherings to remember the people? Here we have to use sources in a sophisticated way. And people who have done tours here would be familiar with it. People like Philip would know it very, very well. But the notion about how a grave can be misleading. There are very few graves, but there are graves. You can follow each one of them of identified United Irishmen. The reason that there are few graves is most of them are buried in pits, collectively, which is what you did to rebels and to soldiers at the time. But this is an interesting one. If you go to Saintfield First Presbyterian Church, you'll find the grave of John Lowry. And on the grave you'll find that he died on the 19th of June 1798. Which is a problem, because it's a week after the rebellion. But we know that he died on the 9th of June 1798. Why do we know that? From a few sources. But most importantly, Thomas Ledley Birch, another kind of vernacular historiography source. The Presbyterian radical minister who preached to the troops at Saintfield, who barely escaped the battle afterwards, who was caught by troops and was supposed to be hanged, but his own brother, again a case of a brother in the government forces, who's a captain in the yeomanry, testifies on his behalf, and therefore he's sent into exile. He barely makes it to the boat because Orangemen catch him and want to lynch him. Makes it to America, and when he's in America he writes anonymously his emigrant's letter home, which is actually his narrative of 1798. And in it we know that John Lowry died commanding a party of people. Now did his family forget the date? They didn't forget the date. You had to code it in a different way. So outside he didn't die in the rebellion. The community and those people who knew how he died. And these stories were kept by different people. You can't not mention this room, of course, Ann McCracken and Jemmy Hope and James Hope, the generation that lived through these stories and kept them the whole time. And the closer they came to their death, and these people lived long lives, these two individuals, they became more and more anxious about who will take it to the next generation. They were afraid of people like Samuel McSkimmon, who tried to collect their papers, and they knew that he would put a loyalist slant on it. They didn't know what to do. But then they found a historian they could trust, in the form of Richard Robert Madden. So Richard Robert Madden, a Catholic from the South, but they could identify exactly around the issues that we heard that happened in this room of emancipating slavery. He was a radical colonial administrator who was in charge of emancipation of slaves in various colonies. And they found a common language. And they saw his respect for the United Irishmen. So they could share with him his notes and their stories. So that's how some of these stories come out. And we could go through this again, this notion about how people learned coded forms to keep their stories quiet for generations. At the end of their life, often this dynamic recurs, they try to bring it out into the open. But even when they bring it out into the open, when you examine it carefully, you see that it's always kept in muted form. Something is told and something is masked at the same time. And that's a process which to see, you'll have to read the relevant bits in the book to see, because it's a complicated process. More than that, and I'll skip this bit, but social forgetting is not just generated. Generation of forgetting works on two levels. It's the generation that lived through the events, that had to deal with its legacy, but it's also generating this language of forgetting and social forgetting. But it's also regenerated. It's passed on to other generations. And you can follow the story through the 19th century, how time after time, traditions of keeping quiet about it, but still keeping the stories are passed on. And at different moments this can come out into the open, and at other moments it goes behind the scenes. Just to run through this quickly, I'll just skip this here. What happens when it does come into the open? I've gone beyond my limits by far here, but just well-known examples. When a monument is made around the time towards the centenary, for example, the monument of Betsy Gray. There's very few public memorials. If you look around Northern Ireland, you won't find public memorials to 1798, unlike other parts of Ireland, where the centenary monuments were put everywhere. When the monument to Betsy Gray was set up in 1896 in anticipation, and this all relates to the novel by Little, and there's a whole story behind it, and the success of this novel, which relies a lot on folklore, is what launches this initiative to set up a monument. What's interesting is, very shortly, even before the centenary, the monument is smashed. This is a nationalist depiction of how it was smashed. It was smashed in a very different way. It wasn't quite like that, but not all that far from it either. And it's interesting, when social forgetting is dragged into the open, when these traditions are not supposed to be shared into the open, often there's a backlash. In this case, a local community, heavily Presbyterian, observing the Sabbath on a Sunday, Unionist, didn't have a problem celebrating their heroine from 1798, but they had a problem with Catholics from Belfast travelling on a Sunday, and Peter's written about this quite clearly, travelling on a Sunday, often women, there's also a gender issue here, publicly laying wreaths on this grave. It's about whose memory does it belong to. And that's why decommemorating, it's the opposite of commemorating, smashing a monument, is supposed to put the memory away. But it doesn't put the memory away. It instigates forms of social forgetting. Because then time and time again you can go to the site and people will point to you where the stones are. And the stones will become smaller and smaller because people chip away souvenirs to keep them. And they'll give it to immigrants going abroad to keep as souvenirs. And the immigrants will come and look for the monument. And this is a game that you can play there time and time again of people coming there. I experienced it myself as a student. The first time I went there, I was walking around with an ordnance survey map trying to figure out where the monument used to be. And somebody walks up to me and says, "Can I help you?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for an older monument." And he pushes the grass and says, "You're looking for this, aren't you?" And he'll show me the place. And then he'll tell me the stories. And from him I can get a poem which hadn't been recited in the area since the 1960s. Because since the Troubles broke out, you couldn't recite the poem anymore. So it's still happening around. I'm going to skip some things here because I've got a lot to kind of say. So give me a second here and we'll kind of bring it to an ending here because there's too much to be said. But I want to actually end with the contemporary. Actually, I was going to say something about Northern Ireland in the years of Stormont, but I won't say too much about that. But I will say that there was an opening up of memory around the time of the centenary and the fin de siècle, the beginning of the 20th century. The key figure here is, of course, Francis Joseph Bigger, who was dedicated to the memory of the United Irishmen and was respected by all sides. But when Northern Ireland was set up, this became a taboo, prescribed in many ways. You couldn't talk about the United Irishmen. It was too subversive. And I have a lot to say about that, but the key line to say about here is that there were always people who broke the silence. There were always people throughout the years who talked about the legacy of the United Irishmen. Some lesser known, some very well known. The book is full of the lesser known, but the well known, I'm sure you know, names like Hewitt, of course, John Hewitt. John Hewitt, his poetry referred to him. He wrote about the weavers. And yet even when he wrote about the weavers, he always stopped didn't engage too quickly in his own thesis, ends just before 1798, or starts just after 1798 to be more precise. He was careful how he dealt with these issues. He wrote a play about the United Irishmen, which he called The Parting of Friends, based on a song, but never published it. It was only published, it was never really properly presented. It's only been read at the John Hewitt Summer School, and was renamed The McCrackens. Sam Hannah Bell, of course, the famous novel, A Man Flourishing. No publisher wanted to publish it at first. It had to be cut down. A lot was taken out of that book, which was interesting. Seamus Heaney, well known for poems like Requiem for a Croppies. But Requiem for the Croppies is about Wexford, it's not about Ulster. Heaney grew up about traditions of Ulster. He slips them in quietly into some of his poems, but then he wrote a whole radio play about Henry Munro, the leader of the rebels at Ballynahinch, but never made anything out of it. So it's always about publishing, not publishing, saying, not saying. It's remarkable, this dynamic, as it returns again and again. So if there's something I'd like to end with, kind of in the context of Reclaim the Enlightenment, is about this unsettling, radical legacy of the United Irishmen, which is here to be uncovered and unpacked with a lot of care. During the years of the Stormont regime, it was forbidden. And at times when it wasn't forbidden, it was always problematic. It was always seen as being co-opted by militant Republicans, which was seen as dangerous. So there's always a dangerous issue. The Good Friday Agreement was supposed to put an end to that. It was supposed to celebrate traditions. But notice one thing, which should be clear in this room now, but maybe 20 years ago if I would have said it, and I was thinking about it as a student 20 years ago when I came to Ireland, but you couldn't say it because it was politically incorrect. It would have been disrespectful. There was something wrong with the Good Friday Agreement, which maybe was right in the Good Friday Agreement, but it was also part of its problems. The notion, which is so ingenious in the Good Friday Agreement, of parity of esteem, which appears again and again in the agreement. And it's so important that each community respects the other community. But what's the problem there? What's wrong about respecting other traditions? That's good. What's the problem?
Because there's a shared tradition in action.
That's very good there. And it's not only that. The idea is that there's only two traditions, even before that. That you have to choose your path, don't you? I'm sorry, I've got to go back to this one. You're either Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist, or you're Catholic, Nationalist, Republican. That's how the parties have to swing. And if not, it's very hard to be the middle ground. We see time and time again what happens with those who try to take the middle ground. You have to choose which path you're taking and be very clear. And that's why the United Irish heritage has always been a problem. Because it defies this kind of dichotomy. You have to find your place within it. So it always unsettles in different ways. I've got much more to say beyond that, but I think we can end with that there's a radical legacy there. And it's a legacy which has always been dealt with. There's always been dealing with the past here. But to look at it, we have to train ourselves to listen to a history of whispers, a history of euphemism, a history of coded messages, a history that sometimes emerges into the open and meets strong reactions and is suppressed and put away. A history which is often unpopular, but popular with some people who take it in different directions, of people trying to own it and take it to their own direction in different ways. If you want the last images, which I'll quickly run through, we would have thought, run through this as well, I'll skip it, that all of this ended in the bicentenary. Since the bicentenary, now it's open, we can set up monuments to the United Irishmen. It's not always clear. There aren't big monuments to the United Irishmen. The monument to William Orr, whose grave for years was unmarked as a family grave, is just a small plaque. There's no monument to William Orr, the Republican proto-martyr. Jeremy Hope, when the blue plaque was put up there, very shortly afterwards it was smashed. Commemorating and decommemorating go hand in hand. And it's these notions which we're still working through, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So I've spoken more than enough. Thank you very much.
We'll take this one. We'll take those.
Yes.
No one was two back there. So
Yes.
So, in terms of like almost like a socio-linguistic universal of remembering the truth, there's an author called Shosser McCracken, who's a very marginalised figure, 1900 to 1900 1990, wrote for 15 years, and his last book was Mavala Kane, My Own Way. And it was a Gaelic proverb, being a near in the shadow, the truth is, it's very old, you get it in Greek, you know, Alethean Skevi. It's a very old, but he took this proverb, and he was a very marginalised man, and he said, they say the truth is bitter, but believe me, it's not bitter, it's harsh, and that's the reason why it's avoided. So I think that, you know, there is this, he puts his finger really on what people choose to remember or to selectively forget. So I just think it would be a very useful quote for some of your...
Very good. Thank you for that, Doctor. But I will pick on one thing I will say here. There's a whole tradition, by the way, which I tried to touch on this book in different ways. There have been attempts to write about 98 of the Northern Irish.
Yes.
And been very interesting attempts from different people. And this has also been a project which has alienated certain people. Because this was, of course, heavily endorsed. One of the most remarkable things of the early Irish state, the Irish Free State originally, and then afterwards with ERA, was to encourage publishing in Irish. And they translated some of the books which were written in English, in Ulster Scots dialect, into Irish. So books like Birmingham's book, there's a famous book, The Northern Ireland, a great novel, about 1700, full of complexities, was translated into Irish. Not that anybody couldn't read it in English down south, but it was translated to Irish. And that is a statement in itself, which works on different levels, but also alienated people as seen as a sign of kind of irredentism, of the South claiming a northern heritage. So this works on different levels, which have to be unpacked as well. So every step you take, it's a minefield. As a historian, I want to see how oral traditions develop with time, including stories which are here now. But I don't accept the stories which are here now as if they were just, you know, they passed from time immemorial. Stories constantly change. New material is added. Stories are lost. And I want to follow this story. So when I hear a story now, I now have enough material to be able to trace when that story first appeared. What's new in that story? What was changed? What is being accentuated? So you need to follow this process. And this is remarkable. And this is where actually Ulster, Northern Ireland, and Ulster, Northern Ireland not the same, of course, where here in the north, there's something unique historiographically which you don't find in other places, and it's very rare in the world in many ways. Ireland has a rich tradition of oral tradition all over Ireland. You can collect stories today and in the past. The Irish Folklore Commission did it in the 1930s. It's a very important, it's a country which has a rich oral tradition. Even today, in the age of phones or whatever, it's still here in different media. But Ulster has something unique. Ulster was always the most literate of counties. This might be exactly the Protestant influence in Ulster, by the way. You can think where that comes from. But both Catholic and Protestant communities were always the most literate. Outside of Dublin, this has always had high literacy, the highest literacy rates in Ireland. So, there's an interplay here which is very strong between written material and oral traditions. Every 10 years or so, when I began looking at it, first I thought there's no sources to do this study. Every 10 years or so, every decade and a half more or less, somebody traveled through Ulster, somebody local, collected oral traditions on 1798. So, people wrote down their memoirs after the rebellion and hid them. People traveled through the area and wrote it down. A generation later, a local priest might have collected it, or the minister, or a traveller who comes in, or an antiquarian, time and time again. And all the way through till the time, like you're saying now, you can still collect stories from people. So when you put this on a time chart, which is what I do as an historian, right? I have to place my sources where they came from. Suddenly I have historiography. I can see how this developed through time. And that's remarkable. I can't think of any other society at the moment where you can, with this kind of resolution, follow the story of folk history over 2 centuries in such great resolution, such detail. And that's remarkable. So by all means, collect stories now, but if you collect them without the context of what happens before, you're missing something. Anything can be told to you. And of course, a lot of the stories we'll collect now are stories that people read exactly things which were collected 100 years ago. Quite often somebody will, when the Irish Folklore Commission was collecting, there was a famous collector, Michael J. Murphy, who collected different areas. Michael J. Murphy, it's remarkable to look at his stories. Some of the stories were stories which were told to him, pure folklore, oral tradition. Other stories are stories that people had read. In Northern Ireland, there was a certain kind of envy at the success of the Irish Folklore Commission, and seen as a kind of Gaelic Irish nationalist project. So there's an attempt to do a similar thing here. In Cultra, you can find the notebooks of that. Only 2 traditions of 98 are found in all the notebooks. There's a problematic topic. One of them is word for word copied from a sermon given in that same community, Grace Hill, 2 years earlier. And I know that because I have the sermon. So that's why you need to do all this kind of search and put them together and you can work out the sources. There's another question here, please.
I live in a place called Brown Square, which is about half a mile from here. And it's where Jamie Hope eventually died. And Brown Square would be seen to be a totally loyalist place and has been for the better part of 200 years. And my question is, if you put your outsider's head on, is do you think there would ever be a time where the blue plaque of where Jamie Hope actually died to be put up in Brown Square, or is that impossible in the future generations?
Great thing about being a historian is I never talk about the future. Therefore, I'm always right. See, I can predict the past with quite good precision. But it already happened in a way. A figure who's now commemorated in a blue plaque, not in Brown Square, outside the Linen Hall, would be the figure to look at, Thomas Crown Duff. Thomas Crown Duff, the shipyard poet, unionist, member of the Orange Order, and being in the, wasn't the Beast Specials, was one of the other kind of paramilitaries at the time, and yet was fascinated by Jamie Hope. Goes around exactly to these neighborhoods and looks at this kind of, there's a period we can do this, right? In the 1930s, it's not popular, but he can write about it because there's a kind of, it's a working class area. He can exactly write about him as a working class hero. In his play Castlereagh, he writes about Castlereagh, and Castlereagh is kind of the aristocracy versus James Hope. So in a way, it's not a blue plaque, but that's an attempt to bring this narrative out. And there's a moment where it could have happened. Theatre was more radical in the past. Experiments had been taken. Something is more not radical now, but there was 2 different moments in Ulster Theatre which are very interesting, where these plays come out. So there were moments like that. Will that happen again? It depends on changing circumstances. The moment it's a time of closing it, isn't it? There was this kind of opening up in 1998 where it seemed that everything was possible. Communities that hadn't celebrated 1798, everybody rushed to jump on the commemoration bandwagon, if you wish. But a few years later, it quickly tightened down. And you can actually see how it's tightening down. If you follow the newspapers, very quickly it happened. And therefore, we really don't know the future, because the commentators, and Peter would remember that when you were exactly documenting what was happening, the feeling was in 1998, I just came to Ireland as a student, was that that's it, forgetting is over. Everything now is out in the open. The memory is there to stay. But you'll never know how it will change afterwards. This tightening came afterwards, and very quietly, it was never announced. So that is what I have to say as a comment at the moment in Brown Square. Please.
Can you mention about us stumbling forward somewhere trying to reconcile our difficult recent history with the Troubles? Would you agree with my thought that one way that has been very well addressed in literature and in writing is the book Lost Lives? I don't know if you're familiar with it. I think it's a monumental work to try and reconcile our past simply by telling the truth about how every person died in the Troubles and giving each story equal weight as much as possible.
Lost Lives is brilliant in every way. It's a book that I keep in my office all the time. When it comes to United Irishmen, that was part of the struggle. 1898, the centenary, was a struggle. And it's a struggle again and again at different times. Who's leading it? What are the politics? Sometimes the struggle is not between Unionists and Nationalists. It can be between Nationalists and Nationalists. It can be between Nationalists and Republicans. What message are we broadcasting here? There's messages, Carmel has written about this in the past. There's messages where you can read very clear messages of Republicans in the late 18th century, which are more similar to social democratic values now. Well, the man of the hour. And look who's here with us as well. It's like a reunion. It's brilliant. Great to see you. Great to see you.